Okay, I'm very excited to be today with Professor Eric Kaufmann.
Great to be here.
And I want to speak about the topic of where is the world is heading to. And the simple question, I was quite convinced, and I think most of the people thought the tendency, and we tend to go to secular world, at least after the modern era, the scientific revolution, 19th century. What is actually your take on that?
Well, my view is that essentially, even though some of the social trends are pushing us in the direction of declining religiosity, the demographic trends in the world are arguably more powerful, and they're pushing the world towards greater religiosity because essentially all the population growth in the world is taking place in the religious parts of the world. And at the same time, we have, even within developed countries, people who are religious, regular attenders have usually between a half-child and a one-child advantage over those who are non-religious. So those forces are the demographics, if you like, are moving us in the direction of more religiosity, not less, even though, in terms of switching behavior, there is more switching, at least in developed countries, from religion to non-religion than the other way around.
So what we will have in the near future? Well, can you give us real numbers?
Yeah, so, well, the other thing I can add to this is that strict religions, what I call endogamous growth sects, religions where they grow their own and they don't recruit through proselytization. And for example, ultra-Orthodox Jews and Amish, for example, they have very fast growth rates because the number of children per woman is sort of 5, 6, 7, right?
Yeah, so exponentially they're growing.
Yeah, and that's happening at the same time as everybody else is declining in much of the world. So, the typical woman in a Western country has about maybe, on average, 1.5 children per woman. There's signs that's even going down. And in East Asia, it's below that. So you have very low birth rates, and so it used to be that there wasn't as much difference. So it's not just that the strict religions have high birth rates, it's that compared to everybody else, the gap is getting bigger and bigger. And also, when you have a strict religion, there's a tendency to retain children in the fold, because if you leave the Amish, you're leaving your family, your friends, your whole world behind. Whereas if you just leave the Episcopalians to switch to watching sports on a Sunday, then that's not going to make much difference to your social life, your world. So these strict religions have both very strong demography and strong retention. Those two things allow them to grow. So where's it all going, you ask? If you take, the Jews are the paradigm case for this, but the difference between secular and liberal Jews on one hand, and particularly ultra-Orthodox on the other, and the projections, and of course we can have a big debate about how accurate these projections are, but they do show, certainly in the diaspora, US and Britain, that the ultra-Orthodox are looking like they're going to be a majority after 2050. That might happen later in the century in Israel. But the bottom line is that what we're looking at, and that's one example. Now, if we turn to the United States, this process is slower, but it's just a matter of multiplication and doing the arithmetic. So the Amish have been kind of doubling in population every 25 years for about 100 years, a little over 100 years. If they keep doing that for the next 2 centuries, there will be 300 million Amish in the United States. Now, okay, it depends. A lot of things can happen.
Today they're about 300,000, right?
Maybe it's up to 500,000.
500,000 already. And beginning of century, there were a very tiny population, just
a few
families.
Thousand.
Yeah.
Same with the Hutterites, another group that has the same demography, that lives a bit in Canada and a bit in the US. And of course the Haredim as well in the US. So all of these groups, if they maintain the kind of growth rates we're seeing, they are going to be very large. Now, the Mormons, you can see that has already occurred. They're at 6 million. Now, there are some things happening in the Mormon Church. I don't know. We'll have to see what the numbers say that would suggest they're having more membership loss and perhaps somewhat lower birth rates, although they always seem to have have been able to maintain about twice the birth rate of the regular white U.S. population. We'll see if that continues. They're kind of a middle case because they have a lot of proselytizing and conversion, which tends to weaken the boundaries to the modern world. And so I think they could go either way, but it's just worth saying they've grown at 40%, I think, per decade for a century. And so I think they've gone, I don't have the total numbers, but they have had this very much exponential growth. That's tapered off now a bit. But I'm just saying that in a way, these groups are probably going to make up a much larger share of the total U.S. population. So you just have to do the numbers. If you think the U.S. population might be somewhere between 300 and 500,000 or million, a couple centuries from now, is that going to be mostly composed of these strong religious groups? Well, possibly. So it is pretty radical.
So it's becoming a real issue. For example, in Israel, we are all in panic because people are understanding that the country is going more and more towards becoming an Orthodox Jewish state, and the share in the population of the Orthodox is growing exponentially. And if when Israel was established, they had in the beginning, I think it were thousands of people, and today we are speaking about 25% of the children going to the first year in the school, they belong to these communities.
Well, that's right. I think the numbers, it's something like several percentage in 1960 in the Jewish school system in Israel, and it's now, I think, a third of the first grade class. Yeah. So that gives you a sense of...
And it's growing.
...what the future is going to look like. And what I think Israel is a good case for what we would call a compositional effect. So some people say, okay, some birth rate differences, but that's not going to affect the whole society. But actually in Israel, I think the reason that the country has shifted in a more religious and nationalist direction, particularly religious direction, has been because of the demography. And then certain groups are growing faster. They tend to vote in a certain way. So Jerusalem, which was the first affected, it has an ultra-Orthodox mayor. Pretty soon you can't have pictures of women's faces on a billboard. So that's what I mean. And we've seen this happen in other places as well. So the rise of the religious right in the U.S., the conservative denominations had about something like a one-child advantage over the liberal denominations. Kept that up for over 50 years. And they grew from a third to two-thirds, roughly, of the white Protestant population. And that was mostly demography, three-quarters. And then once they were large enough, suddenly Ronald Reagan and the moral majority said this is a group that we need to mobilize, and they changed the course of American politics. Mm. So yeah, I would say that these sorts of trends over enough period of time can make a big difference. As we see, and now Israel and the Jewish world is the paradigm case. It's the most extreme case of this, but the same phenomenon is occurring in all, certainly Abrahamic faiths.
But one thing that I wondered, as you spoke, anyway, I think the strictly Orthodox in Israel and outside, the strictly Orthodox Jews are, I would say, relatively well documented. We kind of know about their rates of growth, about their numbers. In my view, significantly less known about Amish in the United States. That term is known. And could you say a few words about this? For example, one reason people are worried, let's say, about the demographic change, because that demographic change doesn't come alone. It comes with political change. So what would be worth understanding is, first of all, what are they politically? Where they fit on the political map? How they vote? It's not something that people on the street would be expected to know. And also where they're concentrated geographically, let's say, and to what extent they're similar to the Haredi demographically. How many children they have? What levels of retention they have, to what extent people leave those communities when they grow up. These things that it would be good to understand. This is the only parallel to the Haredi in a non-Jewish world that I'm aware of, but it's not as well known.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's the only parallel, because there are some other groups, traditionalist Mennonites, the Hutterites, And in Finland, the Laestadian Lutherans, although their retention is not so good, so they're not exactly similar. And then you have the Dutch Orthodox Calvinists in Holland. But so you have different, there's a sort of pathway, but you're right, the Amish are probably closer to the Haredim, and I think they have, not as, if the Haredim are at sort of 6 to 7 children, my understanding is the Amish are more in the range of sort of 4 to 5. The retention, I think, is similar. Now, the Amish the children all have a year where they get to go off and live the secular life, and usually then but in order to come back into the community, so they can go off and drive fast cars and do these things for a year and drink, and then they come back into to the community. But in terms of, they're not proselytizing. They are one of these groups that's about closing yourself off from the outside world in terms of access to the internet, in terms of use of cars, for example, using traditional technologies, and then expanding demographically through internal growth. So they have the same model. Now, I mentioned there's about 500,000 or so, a doubling time of approximately 25 years. So they're playing a similar demographic game. They are not as, they're rural. They're not an urban population like the Haredim tend to be. In the U.S., the Haredim are in, certain parts of Brooklyn, and that sort of urban existence is less common for the Amish. So the Amish would be in rural parts of the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, as well as to some degree Pennsylvania. But they're going further afield. They are in some cases, so in Canada, there are, Amish and Hutterites who will purchase marginal agricultural lands from people who settled there but whose children have moved away. And so you can see where the population decline of one group at the margins of agriculture is being replaced by another group that has the numbers. But because it's small scale and it's rural, it's not as visible. They don't tend to vote or get involved, as far as I'm aware, in politics. So they're not having the kind of political effects we see, say, in Israel. Now, locally, you may get certain things occurring, but even locally...
Maybe they're still too small.
They are too small because
compared to what we have in Israel.
Yeah, because 500,000 in a country of 350 or 330 million is a drop in the bucket. And they won't start making an impact until a century goes by. And then they will make an impact. At what point along the line, locally, they will start to make an impact is difficult to say. It depends how much they spread out. The tendency has been to sort of start new colonies and move off. And to the extent that happens, there may be local effects. Like we're seeing with the Haredim in upstate New York, in some...
But that's what I wanted to ask, actually. The Orthodox Jewish population in the US, even in the future, can they make an impact on the whole country demographically? Because they're a small portion, very small portion now, but they have, like what you said, 5, 7 kids.
So I don't think it's going to show up as a national issue for at least a century. But I do think that in terms of impacts in local politics and local social tensions, that's already there. There are talks of seceding from, in Kiryas Joel, which is the settlement in upstate New York. The Haredim are there, and there's tensions, and one side wants to break away from the other. And so, I think we're going to see a lot of this local level tensions. But it's a bit like ethnic demographic shifts. If they take place at a small scale locally, they don't make it into politics. It's when they reach a certain scale and then national political parties say, look what's happening. That's what happened in Switzerland in the 1920s and 30s, and it's what has happened elsewhere. The United States, the growth, when it was just in Florida and California, it wasn't actually breaking the national storyline, but once it spreads, the Hispanic population then increases in other parts of the country and it becomes a national issue. So I think we're looking at a century before it's a national issue, is what I would say for the US.
If we are talking less about these extreme examples, like the Orthodox population or Amish groups, if we talk about more traditional denominations like Catholic Church, do you think the following is growing?
Well, it's not growing. I mean, certainly if you take the West, the established white populations of the West, They are not growing.
People tend to live in the modern countries, developed countries, the religion, no?
Yes, they leave religion.
Like
There's
UK, I don't know.
Oh yes,
all
UK.
over Europe.
So we just saw in the census that the population of Britain, if you take 20 years ago, the 2001 census measured religion for the first time, 72% of people in England and Wales said that they were Christian on the census. And then in 2011, it was 59%. And then in the last census, I think it's 46%.
So it's less than half of the population is saying about itself we are religious.
Yes. Now, that is mainly a white British ethnic majority phenomenon. There's where the big decline is occurring. But if you take the minority populations here, very little religious decline. Certainly, I looked at the results from 2011. The percentage of Bangladeshis, who are traditionally Muslim group, Pakistanis, Indians, and even Africans who say they have no religion is very small. I mean, it's like single digits. It's low single digits, and it's not changed very much. So the minority groups are retaining their religion here. And in fact, the last census, even though we saw a drop in the Christian population from 59% in 2011 to 46%, in the most ethnically diverse parts of London, Brent, for example, Newham, these are the white population is 10, 20%. It's very small. In those places, Christianity actually had a slight increase because of the African and Asian immigration that brings Christianity in. So it's been this is to sort of say that what you find in these global cities, London is the most religious part of the UK now.
Because of the immigrants. And
all to do with ethnic minorities and immigrants, 100%, almost 100%. It's because they are more religious than the secular natives. So the more of them there are, the more religious it is. And it's a kind of microcosm of the world. The world is very religious. The West, the secular parts of the world, East Asia and the West are not religious, are generally religious, and they're becoming less so. And so the more you have, it's not just non-white people kind of taking the place of white people, it is religious people taking the place of secular people. And so over time, eventually, we're going to see, I think, a reversal of this pattern of religious decline. We're seeing it a little bit in London in certain these diverse areas, but I think in the next census, it's going to be very interesting. I would surmise that we may see London's population that says they have no religion drop for the first time, and that will mainly be because of the growth of the minority population who are more religious. And so that's kind of a way of saying that in these immigration gateway cities is where we're seeing the return of religion on the back of demographic change. And of course we see it globally. The world as a whole is becoming more religious because the religious parts of the world are the only parts of the world that are expanding in population, and most people get religion the old-fashioned way through birth. So this is essentially why the world as a whole is moving this way. And in the West, still the overwhelming tendency is religious decline at the national level, but in the most diverse cities, certainly the most diverse neighborhoods, but increasingly, I think, even at the level of the most diverse cities, we're going to start to see this desecularization take place.
So if I have to create a summary for myself out of what you presented, it would be this. There is a process by which people disassociate from religion. So they drop the Christian label.
Right.
And that reflects their choices in a way. That's their life paths. On the other hand, there's something happening, and that something doesn't depend on any people's wishes. And that is simply the power of demographic. And that, in a way, operates in the opposite direction. So the religious people grow, not because the non-religious become more religious, not because people all of a sudden become convinced, but because they produce more children. It's as simple as that. And that's what's happening in the world, according to the data.
Yes. I mean, this is the story in the Western world, where sociologically, the trend, Steve Bruce, these secularization theorists are correct. that actually the dominant trend is people leaving religion.
Yeah.
But then there's two other things to bear in mind. One is something that Bruce recognized, and David Martin, another secularization theorist, which is that people from minority communities will use religion as a marker of their ethnicity. So if you are Bangladeshi, being Muslim is part of being Bangladeshi. You can't be Bangladeshi if you're not Muslim. I mean, these things are so tightly correlated. So for these theorists, they say, well, religion actually holds up better for people where there's an ethnic difference with the mainstream. Or in a place like Northern Ireland where you have an ethnic conflict and religion is a symbol of both groups. So religion will be more important because it has a secular job to do, according to these arguments. So that what that means is that minorities, they have a protection for their religion. For young minority, Muslims and Hindus, it's more cool to be religious, is not such a sort of stigma. And so for these reasons, the retention is higher, and plus they're growing through immigration and to some degree through higher fertility. And the combination of all that just means that I think there's a big difference between what's happening in the established white majority and in the minority groups. They're completely different patterns going on. There's a small amount of secularization amongst particularly the Afro-Caribbean Christians, but African Christians less so.
But people who immigrate to other countries, I don't know, myself and Dr. Staetsky, we are immigrants. Yeah, we came to Israel, and usually people who change the country, they try to adopt themselves to the local main population and tendencies. I don't know. If I would move to UK, probably I would try to behave like a British, collect the religious part of it, maybe. So you don't see this tendency that it will take over these immigrants?
Well, this is the question, how much will they assimilate to that secular pattern? And I think from what we've seen, the answer is no, because, even though the dominant pattern is secularism, it's not everybody. There are some religious British people still, there are some churches. It's still there. So you can still sort of say, well, if I retain my religion, that is one option on the menu of how to live your life in Britain. So it's not like saying I'm not going to learn English, which is a rejection, right? If you say, well, I'm going to be religious, that's not really a rejection of the mainstream. It's just saying, well, I'm going to take this path rather than this path that some of the majority are taking. So I think that's not necessarily a problem for the majority necessarily, unless the religion has certain practices, and we see that a bit with Islam, where if it's strict Islam and it has to do with, say, the role of women or homosexuals or whatever, then there's going to be a clash with the mainstream. But generally speaking, not really, I think. The pressures of assimilation, they don't function the same way. I think that someone who grows up Muslim and they're young, even if they're in a school with mostly white Christians, they will still maintain their Muslim identity and they may practice. So we don't see anything like the fall off in non-Christian religions in terms of practicing. So that then means that we're heading to a situation where maybe in the not so distant future, non-Christian religions are going to rise, maybe as a large, there may be more practicing non-Christians than Christians, or at least more practicing non-Christians than white British Christians. That's certainly a possibility. That will be a big change. But I think it reflects, again, those two factors of global demography. The parts of the world that have an above replacement fertility are generally all in the religious parts of the world. And then when they arrive in Western countries, their ethnicity, their ethnic difference from the mainstream protects their religion from secularization. And so it is both retaining and demographically increasing, which is the formula really for increasing.
One thing that occurred to me again as you spoke is that, when census results are released to the public for the first time, and for example in Britain, the census results on religious and ethnic composition were just released last week.
Right.
And that's when they noticed that Christians, self-identified Christians, are now a minority. It's still a very large minority, but it's a minority. But what occurred to me as you speak, this is the trend that is visible at the level of a country as a whole. And in a way, the processes of religious desecularization, so increase in religious presence, are seen better at a smaller resolution. So to see that, you should go not to the whole country data, but to London and to particular areas in London even, where the secularization trend is not as strong because white population is not as prevalent there. And there you see stability. There you see that there isn't desecularization. Actually, the opposite process. There isn't a secularization. There's an opposite process where religious communities actually grow. So it's a matter of a zoom. How
Yes.
much you zoom in or zoom out to see those processes. The question I wanted to ask us, and it's maybe slightly controversial to relate to it or not, that's the choice is yours. Often when people speak about religious composition and it changes in it, they speak with a degree of worry. The idea, and they are right, to say that with demographic change, politics changes. What is it that you anticipate? What will happen in the medium future, maybe in the long future, but at least in the medium future, as a result of what you described?
Yeah, dark age.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, a lot is...
Are we in the front of dark age?
Yeah. Well, I mean, possibly that you're right, that if you get these world-denying sects, the Amish or the ultra-Orthodox Jews becoming politically powerful, then yes, they will be able to set rules, like, whether you can show a woman's face on a billboard.
And the Muslims as well, I think.
And Muslims, yeah, if they get now, they don't have power in any Western country that I'm aware of. They haven't sort of been able to be on the winning side in a coalition or, and that will be interesting to see. But of course, if we look at the numbers projected by Pew, for example, for Muslim share,
Yes.
so the Muslim share in Britain went from 4.9% in 2011 to 6.5%.
Yes.
The projection for Pew for Britain around 2050, or is it 2060? And I can't remember 100%. Is around 17%, if I'm not mistaken, and similar for Sweden. Something or 20% for Sweden, 17% for Britain.
Yeah.
Netherlands,
in
something
ballpark, yeah.
in that ballpark. Now, at those numbers, that's like the size of the Hispanic population in the U.S. Now what we've seen with Hispanics, of course, is initially they voted Democrat, and they've now shifted towards more of a balance, and so that means they're not going to have a big impact on the politics, really. But if you had a group that, in Northern Ireland, the Catholics have increased over time, and now they're the first minister, they're the government. That is a situation where if they vote for one party and they have a certain program and they expand, then yes, it will change the politics.
Yeah.
The evangelical Protestants in the U.S. have changed. They grew in the 20th century, and they had a big impact. Certainly in the period from about 1980 until George W. Bush's term in office. And even now, with their support for Trump, even though Trump is not as much of a religious phenomenon, but, there is still that impact on the course of American politics. So we've seen that. And we've also seen the rise of Islamism, which is largely about people moving from the religious countryside into secular cities. And this was important for the politics of Muslim countries. So in all those ways, I think that the religious demography does affect. And so looking ahead, the growth of I think it'll be, you're going to have a Muslim population that's now in a position that is much, much larger. And locally in urban areas, it'll be even more. And I think that will definitely shape the politics of Europe in the period ahead. Now, we've seen jihadi terrorism has kind of gone up and it's gone down. So because it's gone down as an issue, specific concerns about Islam are perhaps at a lower ebb than they were, let's say, in the mid-2000s. But looking at the demography and projecting ahead, I would say this is going to be an issue. When is it going to be a bigger issue? It's going to depend on a lot of cycles. What's going to happen with the other groups is also interesting, Christians and Hindus. And I'm not sure that Hindus and Buddhists are going to be an issue, but I think perhaps the consequences are more going to be seen in the Muslim issue. But I think in terms of getting control of a country, I think it's probably closer in the case of Israel than anywhere else, in terms of a very different outlook getting control. I don't think even at 15, 20%, Muslims in Europe, they're going to be, or in Britain and Sweden, probably heavily concentrated in urban areas where their electoral, certainly in a British system, if it remains first past the post, then their power will be diluted by being heavily concentrated in cities. So it won't be the same existential issue that it will be in Israel if the Haredim, on a proportional one person, one vote system, are able to become large enough to impose their values. Now, I mean, the last point I should say is it depends on the religion's approach to politics. So the Amish are a quietist group that retreats from the world. If you have a group that retreats from the world and doesn't vote, then, which I guess for the Haredim, that's how it used to be, they're not going to have a big effect, of course, but if they are active in politics, then they will have a big effect.
So actually what you are saying, that Israel is currently at the most danger, if we compare to other countries, developed countries.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just because it's the largest proportion. It's a relatively small country, and it's a relatively large proportion who are ultra-Orthodox. Now, of course, in Israel, because you have the conflict with Arab countries, and that conflict overshadows the internal religious division. If that conflict ever were to become less intense, some settlement was worked out and the neighbors became more...
Peace is dangerous for Israel existence.
Well, yeah. but then, actually, I think what you could get is much more of a division politically between the Haredi and the anti-Haredi forces.
I think also the part of the phenomenon that in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox population, they are organized in the political parties. Like if you take Muslim population in Britain, in UK, I'm not sure they're so organized and they have a clear parties to vote for. So maybe majority of them vote for the, general parties like any other. But in Israel, they are very organized. That's also adds to the danger.
Yes, well, it's because of the coalition system, but whereas in Britain, because you have main parties, in the Labour Party, you have, a lot of gays and lesbians, and you have people who are into feminism and then how is that going to work with people who are into traditional Islam? You can make it work when you have a common enemy, but once you have some power, the whole thing is going to be in trouble. I think, and also, some Muslims are voting conservative, but it's mostly Labour. They're very much a Labour voting group here, whereas the Hindus much more are an even split. It's interesting because amongst Christian Africans, if you take African Christians, they tend to be more conservative than Afro-Caribbeans, who tend to be more Labour voters. It's interesting, yeah.
Professor Kaufmann, is the modern Western civilization and the world we live in and we so like to be and to use all the premises of the modern Western civilization actually is over?
Well, I think as Western civilization as we know it is being utterly transformed. So I would say that culturally there will be a lot of continuity, but in terms of ethnicity, how people think of their ancestry, the collective memories and stories they tell about themselves, I think that is in flux right now. So just to give you a sense of the change, in the United States, for example, in 1960, approximately 85% of the population was white, non-Hispanic, and that share is now below 60%. And by the middle of the century, it will be a minority. And the same process of heading towards so-called majority-minority in terms of ethnicity is happening in Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So sometime around mid-century, those countries also, which were around 1960, probably in the Canadian and Australian case, close to 98% white. I mean, that level are going to be falling below 50% around mid-century or soon after. So this is a major shift. Now in Europe, it's not going to happen till late in the century. But in both cases, I think this is going to be a major change. And certainly in capital cities like London, where the white British share has dropped to, I think, about 38%, I'm trying 36, 37, something like that, compared to where it was 50 years ago, which was almost 90%. And it just gives you a sense of the speed of the transformation. Now, and I think this transformation is completely upending Western politics. And so the rise of populism has really exploded since 2014. I mean, there was an earlier wave starting in the mid to late 1980s, and that we saw the rise of Jean-Marie Le Pen, we saw Jörg Haider, we saw the Northern League, these sorts of parties, but only in certain countries, France, Italy, Austria. What's happened since 2014 is we've had a real burst of activity now, and we now have populist parties, national populist parties in almost every West European country. And in almost every West European country, they've broken the 10% mark. And in some cases, such as France, Austria, Italy, there have been elections where they've got over 40% of the vote.
But how do you relate the shift in the population and the rise of the populism?
So the number one issue for populist voters is immigration. Just a couple of numbers for you. 99% of Sweden Democrat voters want immigration reduced. 100% of AfD voters in Germany, in the Bavarian elections, agreed with the statement, Germany is gradually losing its culture. Those are just, and compared to only 20% amongst sort of green voters in Germany. So that gives you an indication of what's really behind this. I've done a lot of statistical analysis. Whether you are rich or poor, you've lost your job or not, none of that stuff matters really. It is very little. So people who say this is about economic crisis, deindustrialization, those things have been going on for a long time. Those things are very minor. In the picture, what really, really matters is this ethnic transformation linked to immigration. So immigration becomes the number one symbolic issue for these parties.
So people are concerned, just maybe even afraid of.
What you find is, psychologically, some people like change, some people don't like this kind of change, and there's people in the middle. This is a disposition that is between a third and a half heritable. It's genetic. So it's actually very strongly genetic where you sit on this spectrum. When the diversity comes in, it splits the population along these psychological lines. If you ask a question like, for example, is it more important for a child to be well-mannered, so well-behaved or considerate? Sounds like the same thing. But if you ask that question to the population, which psychologists have been doing for some time, that question tells you about 4 or 5 times as much as somebody's income when it comes to whether they voted for Trump or Brexit. I mean, that's because it's tapping into those deep psychological divisions, which experiments show. Some people like messy dots on a screen, some people like neat, ordered dots on a screen. If you go for those ordered dots, you also like things to be more orderly in terms of your desk, in terms of dress codes, in tennis tournaments, and those people are less keen on immigration. And so that's sort of what's behind this. Now, on top of that, what we're now seeing is what's called a culture wars emerging in particularly English-speaking countries. So you have first the country gets diverse through immigration. People respond differently. One side says, this is not what I want, I'm voting for populism. The other side says, oh, this is great. And then what happens is they look at the people who voted for Le Pen or for Brexit and they say, you are horrible racists, or Trump, you're deplorable. And these people say, you just called me a horrible person. And then there's this act. You're now into a situation where each side is there's this recursive radicalization. Each side is being kind of radicalized by the other. And I think we're into that spiral, not only in the US, increasingly in other countries. In Canada, for example, now the level of polarization as measured by conventional metrics is pretty much the same as in the United States. It's just that you don't hear about it. So this kind of polarization, we see it on the immigration question. In the US, when it was Mitt Romney and Barack Obama in 2012, there was only about a 10 to 12 point gap between Democrats and Republicans and whether they wanted immigration reduced. With Trump and Clinton, that's now 50 points in 2016. If you go to Canada, it's 50 points. In Britain, it's doubled in size between 2010 and 2019. So you're seeing these partisan splits opening up over these cultural issues. So culture becomes the dominant force in politics, not the economy. Now we're in a strange time now because of the war in Ukraine. The economy is temporarily a bigger issue, but that's not going to last forever. And once it drops down the agenda, all of these other things that drove the populist moment after 2014, I think are going to be right back with us.
Do you want to ask something? Or
I think one issue that is important to highlight, in a way you related to it already, there was this particular line, a journalistic line at the time, in the early days of Trump. They called the group of Trump supporters people who were left behind. And that particular sentence captured in what sense they were left behind economically. They were in areas that somehow declined, that industries withdrew from them, and they simply don't have enough money. That is as simple. They don't have jobs and prospects of that. What you are saying, basically, plainly, it's not that. It's not an economic anxiety. It's some sort of, call it a cultural anxiety about who we are and what the change means. That's the way you present your thesis.
Yes, I would say that it is almost entirely psychological and cultural.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. If you ask Brexit voters in this country, I did this on a survey, how important is pressure on public services as a problem? 0, not a problem at all. 100, really important. The answer is sort of around 50. So it's a medium problem for people. Pressure on public services is a medium problem. If you sort of insert 2 words, immigrants putting pressure on public services, it goes to 70 out of 100. And if you actually think about that, so if the reason people are against immigration is because of pressure on public services, this makes no sense, because why would you be more against the little part of it that is caused by immigration than the big problem itself? That's one example. Another case you've seen, when they do experiments, the psychologists, they'll say, okay, think about America, it's going to become a majority non-white in 2050. So they tell people to think about that, whites in America, and then they ask them about, do you favor free trade? And they become less in favor of free trade. But the free trade is not it's not because they are against something economic like globalization that they are voting for Trump. It's actually that because of these psychological and cultural reasons, they're anti-immigration, they vote for Trump. And because of that, they then have a different view on economic problems. So yeah, I think the economics is very much secondary. We can see this in the 2007-8 economic crisis, had no impact on immigration attitudes or populism across Europe, whereas the 2015 migrant crisis had an enormous effect on populist parties. 2 natural experiments, I think that tells us pretty much what's going on. Now, so what people will do is they'll look at a map and they'll say, these dynamic urban areas like London and New York, look, they don't vote for Trump. And so whereas all of these relatively deprived rural areas are voting for Trump. So it must be about the economics. But the problem with that is they're not accounting for the kinds of people that live in the different areas. So London, once you control for the fact, if you take a white working class 45-year-old in London and a white working class 45-year-old anywhere in England, it's the same share vote for Brexit. It's just that London has a lot of highly educated young people and ethnic minorities. So it looks like it's not voting for Brexit, but actually it's about 38% of London voted for Brexit. When you take into account how ethnically mixed London is, so white British are a minority of the population, actually it's quite a high number. So it's just people are being misled by these maps, which I think are very not a good way of thinking about what's going on.
Okay, but in the global world which we live now, do you think it's possible again to raise the borders and not to let populations move?
Oh, it's certainly possible because, you just have to look at countries in East Asia or, Singapore, a country that small. Yeah, I mean, it's all about political will, generally.
So you mean technically it's possible?
Oh, yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. It's all about values, I think. So if Japan does, or Singapore, they don't want to become a multicultural country, then they just simply tighten their immigration. And I think they have, in a modern country, you have high control. We saw that a bit in the migrant crisis, where some of the Central European countries like Hungary took a very different approach to Germany. Now, granted, Hungary is less of an attractive destination for migrants than Germany, but still, I have no doubt that Hungary could just build fences and control who comes in. ID cards inside, it would be fairly easy in a modern society, I think, to exert control. So it's just a matter of, what do the voters think? So in the US case, white left-wing voters in particular are very much open borders in their views, or at least they tend to favor very liberal immigration. So they're not particularly worried by illegal immigration, and they think building a fence or building a wall on the southern border is a racist thing to do, right? So that kind of gives you an example. So the main reason they are against this is the symbolism of a wall. It's the political will within the country. Whereas if the entire U.S. was agreed that no, we must keep out illegal immigrants, then you'd have a wall and you'd have much more control. Yeah.
Do you see a risk that the radical political parties or movements will take over? And I mean, not like Trump, what we saw in the US, much more radical, like 30s in Germany, for example. And we go back to the beginning of the 30s in Germany.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't think, my view is no. I think that those small groups of radicals, they're going to be there. But we haven't seen a large increase in, for example, white nationalist terrorism. It's very covered in the media, but actually, if you look at actual levels of terrorist violence, deaths, it's not really changed very much. To some degree, these populist parties, one argument based on the data is where the populist parties are stronger, the white nationalist terrorism is actually lower. The populism and the terrorism in some ways are substitutes. So, not substitutes, but the populist democratic politics is a sort of a safety valve in a way for some of this sentiment. My view is no. I think what will happen is you'll just get parties that are voted in to reduce immigration, let's say, and they will just reduce immigration, or they will get rid of multiculturalism. Now, of course, you do have irresponsible actors. Salvini said something about African immigrants. You can get, certainly, you may get a very irresponsible populist figure. But I think for the most part, right now, most of these populist parties are largely about simply, fewer people coming into the country, and also their attitudes on issues to do with multiculturalism, etc., or Islam or whatever, tend to be more conservative. I don't agree with all of those policies, but on the other hand, I don't think this is some kind of a threat to democracy. Now, of course, you do have problems with people like Viktor Orban, or to some degree at the edges, someone like a Trump with the January 6th rioting, not respecting democratic norms and liberal norms. I think that is an issue, but I don't think it's an issue in most cases so far. But of course, anything can happen. But I currently don't think this is a major risk for Western countries.
Could you point to a time in the future when in the major European countries, the majority of the population will be not European, from not European origin?
Yeah, so in Europe, I think we're looking late in this century before that occurs. And I'm trying to think, but of course, the master trend in a way isn't necessarily going to be the rise of non-Europeans. So initially, between now and 2050, even in the late part of this century, we're going to see this expansion of the non-European population. But of course, what's coming in behind that is the explosive growth of the mixed race, part white population, which is currently quite small. In Britain, it's only maybe 2% of the population. But according to projections that I've done with a demographer just across the street here formerly at the London School of Hygiene, we had 7% mixed race population by 2050, so still not that big. But by 2100, 30%. 2150, 75%, and then very quickly it's everybody almost. So I think this will be the story towards the end of our century, will be the emergence of this new mixed race group. Now, much will depend on how they identify. I'm suggesting, I think, they will ultimately come to identify with the same collective memories as the white majorities, and will take over that identity and sort of graft onto it. And now, of course, that's not going to be the entire story, but I think this is partly about the white group, in some ways its boundaries expanding, a bit like the WASP group in the United States, the white Protestant group. After about 1970, 1980, Catholics and Jews became accepted as part of this thing just called a white majority. So you could be John F. Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy in 1960, that was still a big deal that he was Catholic. But by the time we get to certainly Joe Biden or John Kerry, no one even cares. Yeah, that's an example of this expansion. And I think likewise, if you had a Jewish candidate also, I don't think it would be an issue in the U.S. But I think that shows what matters is then the social distinctions run on racial lines. But I think that's also blurring around the edges now with people who are half this and half that, who are mixed. I think they will kind of become part of the majority as well. And some of the survey data for people who are mixed white and Asian, mixed white Latino, those people are, slightly more of them already are identifying more with their white background. It's sort of 60-40. It's affected by politics. If you are a Republican and you are half Latino, half white, you'll be more likely to say you're white. If you're a Democrat, you'll be more likely to say you're Latino. So that you can play around with these identities a little bit once with the mixed population. So I think we've seen this sort of thing happen throughout history. So even in Britain, the Tories would trace more the English origins back to the Normans who started the dynasty. I mean, starting in 1066 with the Norman conquest. So the British aristocracy is of Norman origin, and then the Whigs, the sort of liberals, trace their ancestry to the Anglo-Saxons. This is in the 19th century, and similarly in France. So you have these different origin myths, and I think in the future, this mixed race group, the conservatives will probably say, trace their ancestry back to the kind of long indigenous kind of white populations, and the more left will probably tell a more multicultural story. I envision that's where it may go in the future.
You just mentioned the Jews, and I have a question regarding that. So are we considered actually to be a part of the white privileged majority? Because, throughout the centuries, actually Jews were not treated exactly as the white privileged majorities. And, even in the UK, all this gentlemen's club, Jews could not attend them.
Right.
So and now we are accused, and in the US, some people accuse Jews as be part of this white privileged primacy group.
Well, yeah, so this is very interesting, this whole discourse of white privilege. Now, I think there's no question that Jews, basically, for all intents and purposes, in American and British societies are kind of part of the white majority. But I think...
Today.
Yeah, today, yeah, but not in the past. Oh, absolutely.
Even in the near past, I mean.
Yeah, because in golf clubs and things of that nature, there was up until maybe some decades ago, my father, tells the story of in Canada where, if your last name wasn't Mackenzie or Smith, you were kind of not quite the same. I mean, whether people cared whether you were Jewish or Catholic, I'm not sure how much that mattered. But it's interesting that these distinctions, even up until, a number of decades ago, that used to matter. But I think it's been completely overshadowed now. But I also think the white privilege thing is interesting because this comes, the other part we haven't talked about as much as the changes in left-wing ideology. And I think that's extremely important, that we've had a shift from a left-wing ideology based on class and economics, which is the traditional left.
Yeah.
And the politics based on the Labour Party represents the workers and the Conservatives represents the middle class. Now, Labour and the Conservatives, they have similar class composition. Class doesn't really matter. Economic issues, I mean, it's very, very hard to find any differences, any real differences, or certainly no big differences between the Labour Party and the Conservatives here. So the differences on economics have really shrunk. Similarly, the Democrats and the Republicans, I mean, there are some differences, but it's in the realm of things. When you consider communism and capitalism, it's pretty small beer. But the differences on the culture are massive. I mean, views on, immigration, views on this whole term, should you teach children that the United States is a racist society and it's built on stolen land? You ask that question and you will get, a difference of 50, 60 points between Republicans and Democrats. That's a massive difference.
And what do you think? Should they teach that this is stolen land?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, my view would be that, you have to teach all of these things in world history, the context of world history, which means that everybody was engaging in slavery and conquest and genocide and assimilation. All of these things were the norm in human history. All civilizations did them. Yes, Canada, US, Britain did them as well. So once we understand the global human picture, then we can look at the US within the global human picture. And I think if we see that against the backdrop of the global human picture, we'll think, actually, okay, it was bad, but everything was the same, everything was bad. So let's stop singling out. It's a bit like saying, should we teach children that the United States is a poor, crime-ridden, disease-ridden, tuberculosis-ridden society? I mean, it doesn't mean there's no tuberculosis in America, but come on. I mean, compared to the past, compared to other countries, this is not something that you're going to, you should focus on. So that's my view. Now, of course, you want to teach about these things did happen, slavery, Jim Crow, but my view is you've got to teach it in the context of the world and the past. And once you do that, people will realize, actually, this is not such a sort of original sin. This is kind of a part of human development over time. I think that's really needed. So what we've had, unfortunately, well, in the left is because it's shifted so much towards race, gender, sexuality, the sort of sacred totems of their new worldview. Anything that is perceived to offend a member of one of these historically disadvantaged groups, identity groups, has to be shut down. That could be talking about reducing immigration. Well, that's threatening to people because, a sensitive member of one of these groups might find that offensive. So you can't do that. You can't talk about reducing immigration to Sweden because members of minority groups, some of them might find that offensive. So don't do it. We can't talk about that. And that's what I mean by once your entire worldview is driven by hypersensitivity to disadvantaged groups, or you can't have a speaker on campus who might offend transgender people, or so once you get into that logic, then it affects free speech and Enlightenment values, and of course national traditions are, you're attacking certain groups, whites. So white privilege is really about saying, well, we're not going to look at privilege from high IQ and rich parents and having two parents instead of one. All we're going to really focus on is what are actually quite small privileges, say being white or male or whatever. And we're not going to look at these other things which are much bigger in terms of your life chances. So it's that kind of, and what that then does is it leads the populist side of the equation, not only the populist, but to really react against this. And then so we now have battles over what, because the cultural left has gone so far in schools, in diversity training, in terms of talking about, white privilege and oppression. And this is now leading to these so-called culture wars. But the culture wars are, I think, a second order problem that are layering in on top of the original divide, which was, do you want society to be more diverse and change faster, or less diverse and change slower? That divide, which is the populist versus liberal divide, and then on top of that we now have, well, oh, you voted for Le Pen, you must be a racist. Hey, you called me a racist. You're a politically correct liberal, and then you get into this kind of polarizing division, and that's, I think, where we're increasingly going. And then it starts to affect other issues like that don't have anything to do with this question, like the pandemic. The whole vaccine issue got sucked into this. The environment issue gets sucked into, even though those things have got nothing to do with this. So it pollutes all these other questions because people start hunkering into these tribes. So yeah, I think the white privilege question, and of course Jews are swept into this because they are, wealthier than the average. They're white for the most part. And a lot of the academics in the US who are involved in these battles, particularly against the rise of what I would call cultural socialism, this identity politics, new left. A lot of them are Jewish, a lot of the people who've been canceled. Joshua Katz at Princeton would be one example of that. And so you have and so there does seem to be this, people like Barry Weiss and Jonathan Haidt and Steven Pinker and all these other people are involved in these sorts of battles. But yeah, I think this is an interesting development, and I think this is where the politics is going to go increasingly, is that the profile of these issues is rising. If you look at the newspapers, just since the mid-2010s, mention of all these terms like white privilege, white supremacy, and also woke, and the backlash terminology, it's all kind of just exploding in US, in Britain, in Canada. So yeah, this is, I think, these sorts of culture wars. Again, culture is central, because behind this, it could have happened even without immigration, without diversity. We could have been fighting over the indigenous in Canada and African Americans in the US. But it just adds another bit of fuel to this fire.
What is your opinion on this currently international agenda issues? I will ask more specifically. For example, UNESCO or World Economic Forum. They are promoting openly some documents which they claim they want to, kind of this agenda for the world, like sustainable development. And when you go inside these documents, and I don't want to relate to any conspiracy theories, because I am not a part of these conspiracies. I don't believe in conspiracies. Opposite.
Yes.
But when I open these documents, I see that they're promoting certain ideas, kind of instructions how we should run the world. And it's not only economical issues, they're also going on how the academy should behave.
Right.
What is right and not right.
Yes.
I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, my opinion is somewhat unorthodox in this, in that I think for the most part, these international bodies are not a total sideshow, but they are not the most important actors. In the sense that most of the world, the UN Human Rights Conventions, they tend to be ignored by most countries.
Yeah, that's true.
So a lot of this depends on what the country decides to do with these high-flying documents, these abstract documents, refugee convention, So if you had a country that says, we're going to interpret these refugee conventions as just saying we should say nice things, but not constraining us in terms of whether we can accept refugees. They just go ahead and do that, and they ignore the convention. Similarly, even the European Union, some of the European Union legislation is largely ignored in East Europe, places like Hungary. But it gets them into a little bit of trouble, but a lot of countries don't implement a lot of these laws. So I think the Western, it's mainly the Western country institutions, the top universities, the top media firms, the tech firms. That's really what is the origin of the, what I would call cultural socialist ideas. But also, I mean, The environmental thing is, I think, somewhat different in the sense that, that is a physical thing. You can measure it. It's about science. Whereas something like talking about threats from the police.
No, but what I was amazed,
Yeah,
just sorry for interrupting you. You open a document which is, for example, from UNESCO and it's sustainable development, and you say, okay, it's probably some economic issues, the environment and everything, all is fine. But when I go through the document, I see a reference to Marcuse. Marcuse is, for example, very known left-wing activist in the 70s, 60s. So you say, why he is inside this document? I mean, if he is inside this document, it's a political agenda. So this is the problem.
Yeah, it is a political agenda. Now, I think the way the UN works, I've seen this. I've given talks in some, one or two of these places, and the people from the developing world, most of the representatives are just there. It's a nice job. They don't. In some ways, that's not what's driving this. What is driving it, however, are the people from the West who gravitate into particularly the bureaucracies of these organizations like the UN or the European Union, not to a lesser degree. And so it's those more activists who tend to be from the cultural left. They try and push their agenda. Now, still ultimately, however, those organizations are international. And so the member states have the final say, and they can keep a lid on how crazy these activists want to get. And to some degree, even the European Union will have, Central and East European members. The UN has members from around the world. And those countries are all less radical in a way than the Western countries. So I don't think this is the source of the issue as much as the Western countries themselves deciding, we're going to pick the most radical thing we can find in that UNESCO document, and we're going to pump it up and push it in our universities and our civil service and government and corporation. So it's mainly, I think the West is still in control of this. I don't think the global institutions are driving it. I think the Western countries are selecting what they want to select, and they're selecting the most culturally left thing, and they're pushing it. So that's I'm less concerned about these global institutions having power. I'm much more concerned about the Western institutions that have been captured by the cultural, often radical left, and they are pushing their agenda in the Western institutions, which has a much more immediate effect on people's lives.
When you published the book, which is called White Shift.
White Shift, yes.
Where you were not afraid to take this controversial issue, and you did not feel any pressure on you, maybe in academic environment, because we hear a lot that people cannot be.
Yeah, I mean, academia is very difficult. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's not quite as bad in Britain yet. It is bad. Sorry, if the United States and Canada are at 11 out of 10, Britain might be at 8 or 9 out of 10.
You're very optimistic approach. So Britain is okay.
It's not okay. No. Sorry, it's very far from okay. What I would say is it's not even so much this, which is a big book, and activists will not read this because it's too much. But they will maybe read sort of a journalistic piece. Yeah. But more than that, they'll look at your Twitter and social media and popular media stuff, and then they'll try and go after you that way. So yeah, I've certainly had, by and large, I'd say the reviews were pretty fair. The only sort of, what I would think would be hit pieces occurred in Britain. But even hit pieces aren't bad for book sales. But what I would say is, I was on Ezra Klein's show in the US, and he's a left of center guy, and it was a very good conversation. I think people engaged with the book quite seriously because it's basically fact and evidence based. But it's more the surface froth, the sort of social media things. You are essentially out of the closet because in academia, if you're in the social sciences and humanities, in the United States, in Canada, you're talking about 5 to 10% of the most that are right of center. You're talking about 75% left of center. In Britain, it might be, 10% on the right and 70% roughly on the left. It's something like that. So it's a very lopsided ratio. And if you are kind of out of the closet as a Brexiteer or anyone on the right, then your life is going to be difficult in terms of people, in terms of, depends. I mean, in terms of hiring and promotion, it wasn't an impact for me because I was already a professor, but it could become a problem for you. And in the surveys I have done of academics, a lot of people will write about things that they've heard and seen or experienced if they are a minority politically. There's a lot of pressure, and there's academics, for example, 1 in 3 British academics wouldn't hire a known supporter of the Brexit side in the referendum. 40% of US and Canadian academics wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job.
And that is an empirical finding.
Finding.
That somebody, either yourself or others, found through the surveys where this question was asked.
Absolutely.
Potential employers.
Absolutely. And similarly, by the way, even if you don't mention Trump or Brexit, I mean, if you just say, if you had a right-leaning paper or promotion application, would you judge it less positively? You will get 20 to 50% of academics saying, yeah, I would judge that more harshly. Especially younger ones, especially PhD students are the most politically bigoted. So yeah, I mean, if you are right of center, you keep it in the closet. So there have been studies of asking people, here's 10 papers, code whether you think that's a right of center or a left of center paper from academic papers. And the left of center papers, people were pretty good at identifying the left of center academics who wrote those papers. The conservatives, people couldn't tell because they were essentially just writing very anodyne, very neutral, uncontroversial things. So you couldn't tell that they were right of center because they knew that you've got to stay in the closet, right? So yeah, if you're out of the closet, then it's going to be hard to advance if you need to advance. But if you are where you want to be, then it doesn't matter so much.
You may have noticed, it's a way to wrap it in a humorous manner, that when academics are interviewed in the press and then represented, they're somehow introduced by the presenter. Typically, if there is a conservative intellectual, they call him or her, here's a conservative intellectual.
Right.
They would never say to you, here's a liberal intellectual.
Right.
Because the conservative intellectual, that needs to be qualified, somehow. That's a conservative intellectual. Remember, it's not a real one.
Yeah.
The real ones, we know what they are, which they don't even require a label. Okay?
Right.
That's the way it's. It happens in real life.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is just because they are a minority. I mean, it's like saying, a black intellectual, a gay intellectual. I mean, so in some ways...
it's important to beware. Pay attention.
Right.
Pay attention to what?
Yeah,
what does it actually mean? But beware is there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think that's right. I mean, there is this whole issue of political discrimination and political bias. Right now, what's happening in Twitter, for example, in these tech firms, because of Elon Musk's taken over Twitter and is now releasing a lot of these files over what Twitter did over the years in terms of, disproportionately kind of demonetizing or shadow banning conservative Western accounts. Well, this is mainly because progressive activists target and lobby and put pressure disproportionately on Twitter. And so they're responding to this disproportionate progressive pressure. And so the results are there's disproportionate scrutiny of conservative accounts. But that's only, one example. I mean, again, these studies I mentioned, the issue in a way is that a lot of spaces which have a left of center majority will start to, because of hiring trends. If you just think about, if 9 out of 10 people are left and 1 out of 10 is on the right, but they have the same bias against each other, if someone comes into a room of 10, there's 9 people against and only 1 person biased in favor, they're obviously not going to get the job. So there's something mathematical, even if the prejudice levels are the same, and actually there's more and more evidence that there's asymmetric prejudice against conservatives. So left of center is more prejudiced against the right than the right is against the left, at least in professional settings. In terms of, would you want your child to date a Brexiteer versus a Remainer. It's always sort of 2 to 1. So yeah, I think this is a big battleground, and but it feeds into a lot of what we've been talking about, which is, underneath that political prejudice is the feeling like, well, someone on the right is morally suspect because they're kind of probably a racist and they're kind of a sexist. And so there is this identity shift in the left has really permeated into people's views of the other side politically, and that's driven some of this polarization.
Okay, Professor Kaufmann, it was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks.
Okay, I'm very excited to be today with Professor Eric Kaufmann.
Great to be here.
And I want to speak about the topic of where is the world is heading to. And the simple question, I was quite convinced, and I think most of the people thought the tendency, and we tend to go to secular world, at least after the modern